The rain started before dawn and never let up a steady gray curtain over the cemetery. As men in dark coats lowered the casket my hands could not hold, I stood with an umbrella that kept turning inside out, face slick with rain. I couldn't separate from tears watching Linda Colton's name vanish under wet soil. People whispered behind me about the missing husband, about Hawaii, about photographs no one should post the week his wife was buried. By the last shovel of earth, the wind had a bite to it, and the lilies bent as if they were listening. I thought of the house paint under my mother's nails, of her laugh that moved through rooms like sunlight across a floor. When the priest closed his book, the crowd drifted apart, and I stayed kneeling in the mud until my skirt soaked through and my knees went numb. The world felt smaller without her, the air thinner like a room after a door slams shut. And somewhere above the clouds, a plane flew west, carrying my father toward a beach he'd already claimed as a fresh start. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments and tap like and subscribe if you've ever had to keep moving when someone you love chose not to stand beside you. My name is Hannah, and until last week, my life was quiet in the way small apartments make it one bedroom with a sliver view of the Willamette, a sagging couch I rescued from a thrift store, and a desk that doubled as a dining table when deadlines allowed. I grew up on lists taped to the fridge on thank you notes that were always mailed on the steady lessons my mother taught without speeches. Keep your word, own your mistakes, treat people kindly, even when no one is looking. Money stretched the way a seam stretches a little tight in places, but she made beauty out of thrift window box flowers, homemade bread color on every wall. It was enough. My father moved in a different current, polished shoes and deliberate smiles. Airy rooms with marble and glass that echoed when you walked, the kind of places where silence comes from space rather than peace. He liked to say we were fortunate, and I understood he meant him, because the fortune never seemed to trickle into the corners where Mom and I kept the lights low and the heater modest. The morning the hospital called, I was proofing a layout, half listening to rain on the window, when a tremor in a stranger's voice shifted the color of the day. She said, "Cardiac arrest." She said they did everything. And I said there must be a mistake, because my mother hiked hills on Saturdays and painted until her shoulder ached and sent me photos of bird feeders she'd built from old teacups. My father answered on the second ring voice, smooth as if he were congratulating someone else, said he'd handle the paperwork, and hung up before silence could make a sound. I spent that night staring at a coffee mug that still smelled like her peppermint tea, and by morning the mug was clean, but the room felt stained like grief had fingerprints. 3 days later, I buried her in a rain that seemed to know our name, and my father smiled from a beach through a caption that read, "New chapter," his arm around a woman whose hair caught the sun. The contrast made a hollow sound in my chest, as if someone had knocked on an empty wall. I tried to sleep, and couldn't, the apartment settling in small creaks that sounded like footsteps on old stairs, and every memory had edges. My mother's hand steadying a frame on a nail, her voice reminding me to eat breakfast, the way she tucked receipts into a jar because you never know. Grief ran ahead of me and then behind me, never beside me, and I kept thinking I should call her to say the weather came early and the streetlights were still on at noon. After midnight, I opened my phone and scrolled through her photos, the unglamorous ones she liked best: a crooked pie, paint-splattered sneakers, a garden hose looped like a ribbon on the lawn. I can't say what made me look at my father's page again, but there he was under a sky, the color of warm milk, raising a glass with Sloane's hand at his wrist, 2 faces framed by palm trees, and a horizon that had no room for rain. My thumb hovered over the screen until it fell asleep, and when it woke, the room had a different quiet to it, the kind that turns the sound of your own breathing into news. What came next arrived like a tap on the shoulder from an empty room, a vibration on the nightstand that drew my eyes before I could decide to look away. One message lit the screen with my mother's name at the top in the same blue I used when I texted her grocery lists, when I sent her pictures of thrifted lamps, when I wrote I'd be over Sunday to fix the wobbly shelf. The words were plain enough to feel unreal, only a handful of them, and yet the floor under me shifted like I'd stepped onto a boat. I put on my coat while the kettle screamed and never poured the water, grabbed my keys, and left the lamp on because I couldn't decide if I'd be able to find the switch. The streets shone with rain and neon, the wipers beat time, and the city I knew by daylight held its corners like a stranger holds secrets. When I rolled through the cemetery gates, the fog had stitched itself low between the stones, and the lamps along the path flickered the way lights do in old houses when the wiring needs attention. I parked under a willow. The branches combed the hood, the engine ticked, and somewhere beyond the curve of the road, a figure moved small and careful, as if the ground might give way if it was asked the wrong question. The figure stepped out from behind the willow trees, small and shivering, a coat clinging to her frame as rain poured down her shoulders. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The beam of my flashlight trembled across her face and stopped. It was her. The same pale skin, the same light in her eyes that no storm could erase. My mother alive. The world-tilted sound fell away, and the rain seemed to hold its breath. She whispered my name through the wind, and my knees almost gave out. I ran toward her, half slipping on the wet ground, until her arms were around me. Her touch was cold, but real. She felt smaller somehow, lighter, as if fear had hollowed her out. I didn't know how long we stood there, only that the rain was soaking through our coats, and my heart refused to slow down. When she finally pulled back, she looked around nervously, scanning the cemetery like someone expecting to be followed. "We can't stay here," she said. Her voice was hoarse, raw around the edges. "Someone could see us." I followed her to a small silver sedan parked under the trees. The inside smelled of damp fabric and paint, faint traces of her old studio. I sat in the passenger seat, still gripping my flashlight like a lifeline. "Mom," I whispered, "what's happening?" "You were gone." I saw the coffin. She stared ahead, hands shaking on the steering wheel. Then she turned to me, eyes glistening. "Hannah, your father tried to kill me." The words landed like ice in my chest. I blinked, waiting for sense to return. "That can't be right," I said. He was at the hospital." She nodded slowly. "Yes, he was there, but not to save me." Her voice wavered as she spoke, each word pulling a thread that unraveled weeks of fear. She told me how Gerald had been forcing her to sign over her art studio, her shares in his company, even the small cabin by the coast that her mother had left her. When she refused his threats, changed tone, soft at first, then sharp. He said she was a liability, that she had become a distraction. She described the night everything stopped making sense. She'd collapsed in her studio chest, tightening breath thin as paper. The housekeeper panicked and called an ambulance. At the hospital, while doctors rushed around her bed, my father arrived carrying a leather folder. He didn't ask how she was. He asked where her pen was. He wanted her signature before the medication dulled her hand. When she refused again, he left without a word. She paused, looking down at her hands. I knew right then that he wasn't finished. Her gaze drifted to the windshield, where rain traced crooked lines like veins across the glass. "Paula was working that night," she said quietly. I remembered the name a nurse who used to visit our house for tea when I was a kid, one of Mom's favorite students. She saw the bruises on my arms weeks before. She knew something was wrong. Paula switched the hospital records, marking a false time of death. When the body bag was taken through the back corridor, it wasn't Linda Colton inside. It was a training mannequin wrapped in a blanket and tagged with her name. While the staff believed the paperwork, Paula drove my mother out a side entrance and disappeared into the storm. I leaned back against the seat, dizzy. "You faked your own death." She wiped a tear from her cheek. It was the only way to stay alive. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky, close enough to rattle the doors. She said she had been living in a borrowed cabin miles outside the city, hiding under a different name, waiting for my father to move on. But when I saw the photos of him with that woman smiling, she whispered, "I knew it wasn't over. He's already moving money, closing accounts. He'll come after you next." For a long time we sat in silence, the car engine ticking as rain softened to mist. I studied her profile, the faint scar near her jaw, the streaks of silver in her hair that hadn't been there last month. "Then we stop him first," I said quietly. She turned, startled. "You don't understand what he's capable of." "I do," I told her. "I grew up watching what fear did to you. I'm not afraid of him anymore." She searched my face for something, maybe doubt, maybe her own strength reflected back, and finally nodded. "If we do this, Hannah, we do it smart. No mistakes." The night eased into a dull, wet gray as we drove away from the cemetery, headlights cutting through the fog. Every mile felt heavier, every silence louder. I kept glancing at her, half afraid she'd vanish again, half afraid she wouldn't. By the time we reached the edge of the city, dawn was trying to break through the clouds. She led me to a narrow road lined with evergreens and pulled into a gravel drive behind an old cottage. Inside, the rooms were plain but warm: a couch, a wood stove, a small pile of canvases leaning against the wall. A faint smell of turpentine hung in the air. She told me she'd been there since the night of the funeral, living quietly, letting Paula bring supplies when she could. I sat by the stove while she made tea. The steam fogged her glasses as she stirred honey into both cups, a gesture so familiar it almost made me forget where we were. "You can't tell anyone," she said softly. "Not friends, not the police. Not yet. The moment he learns I'm alive, he'll run, or worse." I nodded, the heat from the mug warming my fingers. "Then we find proof," I said, "something that ties him to what he did." She didn't answer right away. Her hands were steady now, but her eyes carried the weight of someone who'd seen too much. We spent hours going over everything she remembered: the signed forms he'd pushed at the hospital, the sudden insurance updates, the joint accounts she couldn't access. Her voice grew quieter as she talked about their last argument, the one that ended with a bruise on her wrist and a promise she'd be taken care of. When she finished, the clock on the wall showed almost noon. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the world washed clean but fragile. She stood by the window, watching the trees sway. "You shouldn't be here long," she said. "If he sees your car, he won't." I said, cutting her off gently. "He thinks I'm still grieving." Before I left, she hugged me again, longer this time. "Whatever happens next," she said, "don't lose your calm. That's how he wins." I drove back toward Portland with the window cracked just enough to feel the cool air against my face. The city looked different now, too bright, too orderly for what I knew. My father's office downtown stood like a monument in glass and steel, the Colton Development logo catching the afternoon sun. I pulled into my apartment garage and sat there, engine off, listening to the quiet hum of the world that didn't know a woman had returned from the dead. That night I couldn't sleep. The glow from the streetlight painted slow-moving patterns across the ceiling. I kept seeing her eyes alive, pleading, and hearing my father's voice from that phone call, calm and rehearsed. The pieces of my life didn't fit together anymore. When dawn finally touched the blinds, I made coffee. I didn't drink and stared at my phone until it rang. My father's name flashed across the screen, his tone cheerful as if nothing had changed. "Hannah," he said, "we need to finalize your mother's estate today. Just routine paperwork. Come by the house tonight." I agreed before I knew why. When the call ended, I texted my mother. "He's making his move." Her reply came seconds later. "Let him think he's winning." I set the phone down and stood by the window, watching clouds roll in from the west. The air had that quiet before a storm feel again. The same weight I'd felt at the cemetery, the same sense that something was about to shift. And deep down I knew by the time the rain returned, nothing in our family would ever be the same. The morning light pressed through my blinds in faint stripes, too bright for how heavy the air felt. I hadn't slept. Every creak of the apartment had kept me alert, my mind running through what my father's next move could be. When my phone rang at 8, his name lit up the screen like a warning. I answered anyway. His tone was smooth, almost cheerful, as if nothing had changed. "Hannah, I'm finalizing your mother's estate today," he said. "I'll need your signature on a few papers." I gripped the phone tighter. "What kind of papers?" He chuckled lightly. "Just standard transfers, honey. Nothing to worry about. Come by the house tonight." When the call ended, I stared at the screen until it dimmed. Outside, the street was slick with leftover rain glistening under a thin patch of sunlight. I texted my mother immediately. "He's making his move." Her reply came seconds later. "Let him think he's winning." All day I tried to work but couldn't focus. Every line I drew, every color I adjusted on the screen, blurred into meaningless shapes. By the time evening came, the sky had turned the same dull gray as the day of the funeral. I drove back to the house I'd grown up in, watching the familiar streets pass like memories that no longer belonged to me. The front gate stood open, the garden trimmed too neatly, every light in the house on. When I walked inside, my father was waiting in the foyer, dressed in a charcoal suit that looked freshly pressed. "You look tired," he said with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Grief does that." I met his gaze evenly. "You seem to be managing just fine." His smile tightened. "No use dwelling on things we can't change." He gestured toward his office. "Come in. Let's take care of this quickly." The office looked the same as I remembered: mahogany shelves, perfectly aligned files, and the faint scent of cigar smoke beneath layers of polish. He slid a thick folder across the desk. "These are property transfer forms," he said. "Since you're your mother's only heir, you'll need to sign them so I can consolidate ownership." I flipped through the pages, my stomach tightening. My mother's signature was already there, neat and perfect. Too perfect. "She signed these before she passed," he said, watching my face. "We were planning ahead." I set the papers down. "You forged her signature." He let out a soft, dismissive laugh. "You think I'd risk that?" "Don't be dramatic, Hannah." I pushed the folder back across the desk. "She told me she'd rather burn everything than let you have it." His expression hardened and the air seemed to shift. "Sit down," he said quietly. I didn't move. "I'm not signing." His eyes narrowed. "I know you're grieving, but this isn't the time to challenge me. You don't want to make me force your hand." Something in his voice, cold measured, snapped something inside me. "You already killed her once," I said. The words hung between us, sharp and unplanned. His face went still. "What did you say?" I met his eyes. "You won't get away with it." For a second I saw it, panic flickering behind the mask. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping the floor. "You've been talking to someone." I turned toward the door. "We're done here." His voice followed me, low and dangerous. "Get out before you say something you'll regret." I left without another word, but as I walked down the hall, I caught a glimpse of the mirror on the wall, the one angled toward his desk. Behind the reflection of his shoulder was a small safe, half hidden by a framed family photo. I filed it away silently and kept walking. That night, the sky broke open again. Rain streaked the windows and thunder rolled over the hills. I parked down the street from the house, waiting until every light inside went dark. My hands shook as I unlocked the side gate with the old spare key I still carried from high school. The door to the office creaked softly when I opened it. The safe stood just where I'd seen it, the paint worn around the handle. I tried 3 combinations, birthdays, anniversaries, before I paused. My mother's birthday. The lock clicked open. Inside were stacks of bank statements, printed contracts, and several envelopes marked with foreign addresses. At the bottom lay a small flash drive in a plastic sleeve. I copied everything onto mine, every page and number that looked out of place. My pulse thudded in my ears as I closed the safe and slipped out the back door. The rain had picked up, drowning out the sound of my footsteps. I ran to my car, started the engine, and didn't breathe until I reached the first intersection. When I finally stopped at a red light, I glanced at my phone. A new message waited on the screen. "You think I wouldn't notice, Hannah?" My chest tightened. It was from him. Before I could react, the phone rang. His voice was steady, almost calm. "You were always clever," he said. "But you forgot who taught you how to lie." I forced the words out. "You don't scare me." He laughed softly. "Don't I come home?" "Hannah, let's talk, or I can make sure you regret what you stole." "Stole," I said, gripping the wheel. "You mean evidence." There was silence on the line, and then he spoke so quietly I barely heard him. "If you're smart, you'll destroy it. Otherwise, maybe another funeral will be needed." Then the call ended. I sat there for a long time, the wipers dragging across the glass, the world outside blurring into gray streaks. The threat echoed in my head, but beneath the fear was something stronger. My mother's voice, steady calm, telling me not to lose mine. I drove straight to the safe house, headlights slicing through the rain. When I pulled up, Mom was waiting at the door, wrapped in a blanket, worry etched across her face. "Hannah, what happened?" she asked as I stepped inside. I dropped the flash drive onto the table. "He knows," I said, "but we have everything: accounts, fake contracts, transfers, enough to bury him." She stared at the drive, her hand trembling. "If we go to the police, he'll come after us before they can act." I met her eyes. "Then we make him destroy himself." She hesitated, then nodded slowly. The room felt smaller, but the air sharper, alive with purpose. We worked through the night, sorting files, encrypting copies, documenting every signature and statement. Paula came by before dawn, still in her scrubs, her face pale with exhaustion, but her hands steady as she helped scan the papers. We laid out a plan, sending anonymous packages to the FBI and financial regulators, creating backups on drives hidden in 3 different places. Mom reached out to her old friend Marina Cole, now an attorney, asking for guidance on the statement she would give when the time came. By sunrise, my eyes burned from lack of sleep, but the fear that had haunted me for weeks had shifted into something solid: resolve. The storm outside had calmed, leaving only the steady drip of rain from the roof. Mom sat at the table holding the mug of tea Paula had made, her gaze fixed on the window. "He won't stop," she whispered. "He'll come." I looked at her and nodded. "Then we'll be ready." The day stretched quiet and long, the kind of silence that waits for something to happen. By evening, the light outside had turned copper, fading into night again. I heard it before I saw it: headlights sweeping across the windows, slowing as they turned into the drive. My mother's hand found mine under the table. "It's him," she said softly. The knock that followed was hard enough to rattle the frame. "Hannah." My father's voice carried through the door, sharp and commanding. "Open up. Let's end this game." I met my mother's eyes and stood. "Stay behind me," I said. I walked to the door, heart-pounding hand on the latch. The storm was back again, distant thunder rolling closer. I took one breath and opened the door, and there he was, drenched, furious eyes wild as if the rain itself had chased him here. "Where is she?" he demanded. The air between us felt charged, brittle with everything we'd both kept buried. The next moment would change everything, but I didn't back away. The sound of sirens was still far off, then faint, but growing like the first promise of justice breaking through the storm. The rain poured so hard, it blurred the porch light into a pale halo. My father stood on the doorstep, drenched, his hair plastered to his forehead. The look in his eyes was wild enough to make me forget the years of practiced calm he wore like armor. "Where is she?" he demanded, his voice rough, cutting through the sound of the storm. I didn't move. "Who?" I asked, steady as I could manage. "The wife you buried, or the woman you tried to erase?" He pushed past me before I could stop him, his soaked shoes leaving streaks on the wooden floor. The air in the house turned sharp electric. "Evelyn," he shouted, using her middle name like a command. His voice filled the small rooms, bouncing off the walls, until it didn't sound human anymore. I followed him down the hallway, my hand trembling on the edge of the doorframe. My mother stepped out from the shadows near the kitchen, fragile but unflinching. "I'm right here," she said. For a heartbeat, everything froze: the rain, his breathing, even the flicker of the lights. His expression collapsed from fury to disbelief. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "You're dead." Mom's face stayed calm, the kind of calm that comes from running out of fear. "You wanted me to be," she said. His mouth twitched into a bitter smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You have no idea what you've done. You think you can take everything I built? You wouldn't have a life without me." He stepped closer, but I moved between them. "You already took enough," I said. "You don't get to take any more." Outside, the faint wail of sirens began to rise, soft at first, then louder with every passing second. He turned sharply toward the window, his jaw tightening as red and blue lights cut through the rain. "What did you do?" His voice cracked, not from fear, but realization. Mom met his gaze without flinching. "We did what you taught us," she said quietly, "covered our tracks. Only you left too many." The pounding on the front door came next, 3 sharp knocks that echoed through the house. "FBI," someone shouted. "Gerald Colton, we have a warrant for your arrest." My father spun toward me, panic finally breaking through the control that had ruled him for decades. "Tell them they're wrong," he begged. voice shaking. "Hannah." Tell them I didn't answer. I just looked at him, seeing not the man who raised me but the stranger who had destroyed everything good in our home. "You buried the wrong woman, Dad." He lunged forward, grabbing for my arm. But the agents were already inside. They pulled him back, shouting commands I barely heard over the rush of blood in my ears. The cuffs snapped shut around his wrists with a metallic click, and for the first time, he looked small. "You'll regret this," he spat, his eyes burning through me. My mother stood behind me, her hands steady now. "No, Gerald," she said softly. "I already did." They led him out into the storm, his footsteps heavy on the wet porch. I followed to the doorway, watching as the rain swallowed him up. The lights from the patrol cars glared against the puddles, and for a moment the scene looked almost unreal. A man who once towered over everyone, now bent beneath the weight of his own choices. When the last car door slammed, the silence that followed was almost unbearable. Inside, Mom sank onto the couch, her breath trembling, but even. I sat beside her, feeling the exhaustion seep in all at once. "It's over," she whispered, her voice barely there. I took her hand, still cold from the night air. "Not yet," I said softly, "but soon." The storm passed with dawn. Pale light crept through the curtains, turning the living room gold and gray. Paula arrived just after sunrise, still wearing her hospital jacket. She froze when she saw my mother sitting there alive, tears welling in her eyes. "You did it," she said, half in disbelief. Mom smiled faintly. "We did it." Paula walked over and hugged her tight, whispering something I couldn't hear. When she left, I stood by the window, watching the clouds pull apart over the city. For the first time in weeks, the sky didn't look like it was morning. By noon, the calls began. Reporters, lawyers, even old acquaintances pretending to check on us. Every message said the same thing: Gerald Colton arrested for fraud, embezzlement, and attempted homicide. His photograph was already everywhere, the confident smile from his company brochures frozen under bold headlines. I turned off the television before Mom could see it. She didn't need to. She just sat there quietly, holding a cup of tea that had gone cold, staring at nothing in particular. That evening, we packed what little we had at the safe house. "Where will we go?" I asked. She folded one of her paint-stained sweaters into a small bag. "Somewhere the air feels clean," she said. Paula had arranged for a temporary hotel room under a different name just until the questioning ended. Before we left, Mom stood in the doorway looking back at the house one last time. "He'll be gone from here soon," she said. "Then we can start over." We drove in silence most of the way. The city grew smaller in the rearview mirror, the skyline fading into mist. I reached over and turned on the radio, hoping for distraction, but every station carried the same story his downfall told, in crisp, detached voices. My mother's name came up once mentioned as the wife who returned from the dead. She turned it off before the next sentence finished. At the hotel, the walls were thin, and the room smelled faintly of salt from the river outside. We drew the curtains and sat across from each other, the weight of everything finally settling in. "He'll fight it," I said quietly. "He always does." Mom nodded. "But the truth's bigger than him now." She took a deep breath, her eyes meeting mine. "You were brave tonight, Hannah. More than I ever was." I shook my head. "You survived." "That's what brave looks like." Outside, traffic hummed like distant waves. For the first time in months, I let myself close my eyes. The sounds of the city faded, replaced by the quiet rhythm of her breathing across the room. Somewhere beyond those walls, the case had only just begun paperwork trial statements. But for now, in that small space, we were safe. Before sleep found me, I thought about the years that had led here, the family dinners that ended in silence, the whispers behind closed doors, the laughter that never reached the eyes. It all felt like a life someone else had lived. Tomorrow would be different. There would be questions, cameras, and truths too heavy to hide anymore. But tonight, there was just the sound of rain easing off the windowsill, and my mother's voice barely above a whisper saying, "We made it through." And in that stillness, I knew the storm had finally broken. Yet part of me also knew the hardest part wasn't the rain we'd survived, but the light that would come next. By morning, word of my father's arrest had spread across every channel, every paper, every corner of the city that once praised his name. I woke to the sound of my mother's phone buzzing, non-stop news alerts flashing like sirens in the dark hotel room. The light through the curtains was dull cold, as if even the sun was unsure how to rise after a night like that. Mom sat at the small desk, still wearing the same clothes from the day before, her hair pulled back in a loose braid. "They want statements," she said quietly. "Reporters, investors, former clients. Everyone wants to know what we'll say." I poured coffee into 2 paper cups, setting one beside her. "Then we tell the truth," I said. She nodded slowly, but her hand trembled around the cup. "The truth isn't always what people want to hear, Hannah. They'll think I came back for revenge." I met her eyes. "You came back to live." The days that followed moved strangely fast and slow at the same time. There were meetings with investigators, stacks of documents, and quiet hours where the hotel walls felt like they were closing in. Paula stopped by whenever she could, dropping off meals, reminding us to rest. Marina called daily, guiding us through legal language that sounded more like another dialect than English. Every new report about the case pulled another layer off the image my father had built. Offshore accounts, false contracts, shell companies in places I'd never heard of. One night while Mom reviewed a new list of subpoenas, she looked up from the papers. "He always said he built this family on hard work," she murmured. "I guess he just never said whose work." I didn't know how to answer, so I sat beside her in silence. Outside, the rain had started again, steady and calm, as if the world had settled into its rhythm again after weeks of chaos. 3 months later, the trial began. The courthouse smelled faintly of dust and old paper, and the corridors echoed with camera shutters and murmured questions. I remember standing in line for security, the cold metal detector brushing my wrist, my mother's hand finding mine before we walked through. Inside the courtroom, everything felt heavier than air. The polished wood, the low hum of whispers, the eyes that followed us as we took our seats. My father sat at the defendant's table, a gray suit hanging too loose on his shoulders. His hair had thinned his skin, pale under the harsh lights. He didn't look at us when we entered, not even when Mom took the stand. The room fell quiet when she began. Her voice didn't shake. She spoke of years of control and threats of signatures demanded, and lives reduced to balance sheets. She told them about the night in the hospital, the forged paperwork, the pain that came before the silence. "I faked my death," she said plainly, not to hurt him, but because I believed he would kill me if I didn't. The words hung in the air, unflinching, the kind that needed no embellishment. The crowd stirred, some gasped, others scribbled notes, but Mom never broke eye contact with the judge. For the first time in years, she owned the truth that had once nearly destroyed her. When she stepped down, her face was pale but steady. I met her halfway, touched her shoulder, and she smiled faintly. "Your turn," she whispered. I took the stand next. My palms were damp against the wood railing, my voice thinner than I expected at first. The prosecutor asked about the night of the funeral, about the text that brought me to the cemetery, about finding her alive. I told them everything, every detail that connected the pieces together, the forged transfers, the safe, the flash drive, the phone call where he threatened me. When the defense tried to twist it, suggesting fear had made me over-imagine, I looked at my father for the first time. He looked smaller than I remembered. The confidence that once filled every room he walked into had drained out of him. When our eyes met, I said quietly, "He taught me to be brave. I just don't think he expected I'd use that bravery to stop him." His face twitched, but he said nothing. The silence that followed was so thick that even the court reporter's keys paused mid-stroke. Marina played the recordings next, the arguments, the accounts, the trail of his voice turning manipulation into confession. Each sound clipped through the speakers like cracks in a dam. When the flash drive's data appeared on the screen, numbers, transfers, timestamps, the weight of his empire began to crumble piece by piece. By the time closing arguments ended, there was no performance left in him. He sat motionless, hands folded, staring at a spot on the floor. When the jury filed back in, every sound in the room seemed to fade. The shuffling papers, the coughs, even my heartbeat. The foreman's voice was clear. Guilty on all counts. The judge's words followed steady as rain on stone. Gerald Colton, you are sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. For a moment, everything went still, like the world itself needed to absorb the sentence. My father closed his eyes and his shoulders sank. The man who once demanded control over every room no longer had any. As they let him out, he turned his head just enough to look at us. There was something almost unrecognizable in his expression. Not anger, not even hate. Maybe it was disbelief, or the faint shadow of the man he used to be before ambition replaced everything else. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but the guards pushed him forward, and the door shut behind them with a sound that felt final. Outside, the cameras swarmed again, microphones pushing toward us like reaching hands. Mrs. Colton. How does it feel to bring down one of Portland's most powerful men? Someone shouted. Mom paused at the courthouse steps, blinking against the flash of lights. It doesn't feel like victory, she said softly. It feels like freedom. That night back at the hotel, the quiet felt strange after weeks of constant noise. The clock ticked softly on the nightstand, and the rain had returned again, light and rhythmic. Mom sat by the window, her reflection faint against the glass. When I married him, she said, voice barely above a whisper, I thought he built things. I didn't realize he only knew how to destroy them. I moved closer, resting a hand on her shoulder. He won't destroy us anymore, I said. She nodded, her eyes tracing the distant lights of the city. For the first time in a long while, she didn't look afraid, just tired and free. The next morning, I woke to sunlight instead of rain. The headlines filled with words like, Justice Fraud Sentence. But I didn't read them. The noise had finally run its course. I brewed a small pot of coffee and opened the window, letting the fresh air in. Somewhere beyond the glass towers and courtroom walls, life was beginning again, quietly, steadily, like dawn after a long storm. And though I didn't know what would come next, I knew we would face it differently. Not as people defined by what he took from us, but by what we had reclaimed, truth, freedom, and the strength to build something that no one could twist or control again. That strength would soon lead us somewhere new, a place neither of us expected, where the air really did feel clean. But we hadn't found it yet. Not quite. That part was still waiting just beyond the morning light. After the verdict, life moved forward in fragments. The noise that had followed us everywhere, reporters, lawyers, endless phone calls, finally began to fade. Days stretched quieter, softer, and the silence felt new, almost unfamiliar. My mother and I packed what little we still owned from the hotel and headed west toward the coast. She wanted air that didn't smell like the city, she said. Somewhere we could hear the water instead of traffic. We drove until the skyline disappeared behind pine trees and salt wind filled the car. The cottage we found sat at the edge of a small Oregon town, its white paint peeling under years of rain and sea breeze. The porch tilted slightly to one side, and wild daisies pushed up through cracks in the path. It was nothing like the house we'd lost, and maybe that was the point. Inside, the walls smelled faintly of wood smoke and salt. My mother set down her box of brushes and canvases, like someone returning a heartbeat to an old room. "It'll do," she said, smiling softly. We spent the first week cleaning. The windows stuck, the faucet dripped, and every floorboard seemed to have its own opinion. Still, each morning I woke to the sound of gulls and waves instead of sirens. The rhythm of ordinary life returned slowly. Coffee in chipped mugs, laundry, drying on the line, dinners cooked without checking the locks twice. My mother began painting again, small things at first, the curve of a shell, a single flower, a child's kite tangled in the dunes. Her hands, which had once trembled, moved steady now. One afternoon, while I was unpacking supplies for my design work, she came to the doorway of my studio corner. "I've been thinking," she said, "you should open your own business here. You're good at what you do." The idea had been sitting quietly in my head for weeks, waiting for the right moment. "I was going to call it Colton Design," I admitted. She shook her head gently. "No. Something new. Something ours." A month later, a small wooden sign hung outside a refurbished storefront near the pier, Evelyn and Hannah Design Studio. The name felt right. Inside, the walls were soft gray, the light clear and bright from the ocean-facing windows. We filled the shelves with samples, logo prints, art books, color palettes, and one of her paintings hung behind the desk, a field of wild daisies blowing against a blue horizon. People stopped in, often curious about the new sign in town. Some asked if we were mother and daughter. My mother always smiled and said, yes. Finally, building something together. The routine settled us in ways neither of us expected. Mornings began with her teaching art lessons to local kids in the small studio behind the cottage. Their laughter drifted through the open windows as I worked on projects for nearby shops and nonprofits. The town was kind, the pace unhurried. Sometimes when I watched her talking with the children, her apron splattered with paint, I could barely connect her to the woman who once hid from the world. Still, some nights, the past reached back. News stories about the trial would resurface, usually written by someone trying to spin a new angle. The wife who returned from the dead. The heir who exposed a tycoon. We ignored most of them. But the letters were harder to ignore, requests for interviews, offers for book deals. Strangers asking if the story was real. My mother kept them in a small wooden box under her bed. The truth belongs to us, she said when I offered to help answer them. We don't owe it to anyone else. On an early spring evening, the air smelled of rain and honeysuckle. My mother stood on the beach, easel planted in the sand, painting the sunset as it melted into gold. I walked up beside her, watching the brushstrokes move across the canvas. "What are you painting?" I asked. She didn't look up. "Freedom," she said simply. The waves rolled in behind her, slow and steady, as if echoing the word. I started bringing my laptop to the beach after that, working beside her while she painted. Clients from Portland began to find me again, old contacts who'd heard I'd started fresh. Each project reminded me that I didn't need the old life to define success. We both began earning just enough to live comfortably, not extravagantly, but with a peace we'd never had before. One afternoon I came home to find her sorting through a box of old photographs. Most were from years ago, vacations, family dinners, moments that felt distant. She handed me one I hadn't seen before, a younger version of her laughing in a field of sunflowers. "Paula took that," she said. "She said I looked happy." I looked at her, then at the photo. "You still do." She smiled faintly. "Maybe now I mean it." As months turned into a year, the rhythm of our lives became something gentle and whole. We planted a small garden behind the cottage, and she painted a mural on the back fence, flowers winding up into the blue like they refused to stop growing. On weekends, we hosted small workshops teaching art and design to anyone curious enough to learn. The laughter, the smell of turpentine, the sound of ocean wind, it all mixed into something that finally felt like home. Sometimes people recognized her. Tourists would stop in, eyes wide, whispering before they spoke. "Are you—" They'd begin, and she'd nod before they could finish. "I'm Linda," she'd say, "but I'd rather talk about the art." Most understood. The few who didn't left, disappointed that she wouldn't feed their curiosity. She didn't owe them the story anymore. One evening, near the anniversary of the trial, we sat on the porch watching the sunset burn low behind the horizon. She poured us each a cup of tea and handed me a letter with no return address. "This came today," she said. The handwriting was unfamiliar, blocky, careful. Inside a few short lines, "You were right to fight back. I hope the ocean is kind to you. S." I turned the note over, confused. "Do you think it's from her?" I asked, meaning Sloane. My mother folded the letter once and slipped it back into the envelope. "Maybe," she said. "Maybe it doesn't matter." She looked out toward the sea. "Everyone finds their own kind of freedom eventually." That night the wind came in strong off the water, rattling the windows, and I dreamed of the storm that had started it all, the rain, the sirens, the sound of my father's voice fading into the distance. But when I woke, the only thing I heard was the ocean calm and steady outside our door. We had both learned how to live again, not through what we'd lost, but through what we were finally able to build honestly, quietly together. I didn't know then that a small mystery still waited for us, just beyond that peace one, that would remind me that some beginnings never really end. It would start, as most things in our story did, with a message that neither of us expected. The message came late, long after the lights in the cottage had dimmed. My phone buzzed once on the table beside me, a soft vibration in the quiet. I reached for it half asleep, expecting another update from a client, but the screen stopped me cold. It was from a blocked number, just a single line. "You should know who sent that text that night." For a moment, I stared, my mind reaching backward through time to the funeral, to the rain, to the words that had changed everything. "I'm not dead. Come to the cemetery now." The glow from the phone lit the room faintly. I got up, padded to the window, and looked out over the yard. The ocean was a dark blur beyond the trees, the sound of the waves faint under the wind. I read the message again, slower this time, as if meaning might hide between the words. There was no signature, no number, just that strange sentence. I didn't wake my mother. She had fallen asleep in her chair, a book folded over her chest. I let her rest and stayed up instead, watching the horizon lighten from gray to blue. In the morning, I found her in the kitchen, humming softly as she brewed coffee. I told her about the message, sliding my phone across the table. She frowned, reading it twice. "Blocked number?" she asked. I nodded. She set the phone down gently. "Maybe it's nothing," she said, but her voice had that old tremor in it, the one that meant she was thinking of everything it could be. Or maybe it's something I said quietly. After breakfast, I drove into town to pick up supplies for the studio. The morning sun had broken through the clouds, glinting off the waves as I followed the coastal road. But the message lingered like fog in the back of my mind. At the market, a familiar voice called my name. Paula stood by the register, her smile soft but tired. She'd taken a nursing job at a small clinic nearby. We hugged, and she asked how we were settling in. When I mentioned the text, her expression changed. "You got that too?" she asked, lowering her voice. My heart skipped. "What do you mean?" She looked around, then pulled out her phone. "Last night. An email from an address I didn't recognize. It said she was never supposed to find out who sent it. That's all." We stood there for a moment, both silent. Then Paula shook her head. "It's probably just someone stirring up old news," she said, trying to sound casual, but her eyes didn't match her voice. Maybe I said, though we both knew, it didn't feel random. When I returned home, Mom was sitting on the porch, paintbrush in hand, but unmoving. The sea breeze had tangled her hair, and the half-finished canvas beside her showed nothing but rough strokes of gray. "I've been thinking about that text," she said as I joined her. That night, my phone was off. Paula had it. I never sent anything. I told her what Paula said at the store, and for a long time we sat in silence listening to the surf. Finally, she sighed. Maybe someone wanted to make sure we met, someone who knew more than we did. We spent the afternoon searching old messages, numbers, anything that might lead to an answer. Nothing came up. But later that evening, as the sky deepened to gold, a car pulled into the gravel drive. My mother straightened in her chair. A woman stepped out, tall and gray-haired, wearing a linen jacket. It took me a moment to recognize her. "Marina," Mom whispered. Our attorney smiled as she climbed the porch steps. "I was passing through," she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. We brought her inside, and she accepted a cup of tea before pulling a small envelope from her bag. "This came to my office 2 days ago," she said. "No return address, no name. I thought you should have it." Inside was a printed photograph, grainy, clearly from a security camera. It showed the cemetery at night, the faint outline of a figure near the gate holding a phone. The timestamp was the night of the funeral. My throat tightened. "That's when I got the message," I said. Marina nodded. "It looks like someone waited to see you arrive." My mother took the photo carefully, her hand shaking slightly. "You think someone was watching?" maybe Marina said. "Or making sure you both survived long enough for the truth to come out." We sat at the table long after she left the photograph between us. The air smelled faintly of salt and tea leaves. Finally, my mother spoke. "I can't decide if this makes me grateful or terrified." I looked at her. "Maybe both," I said. For a few days, the quiet returned. Life moved back into its rhythm, work at the studio, her art classes, walks on the beach. The sky cleared after weeks of rain, and the garden started to bloom again. But the thought of that photo followed me like a shadow. Late one evening, as I was closing up the studio, my phone buzzed again. Another blocked message. "The truth finds its way even when people can't." This time, I didn't hesitate. I called Marina. She picked up on the second ring. "Save the message," she said calmly. "I'll look into where it came from." Her composure steadied me, but when I hung up, I noticed my hands were trembling. I locked the door, turned off the lights, and stepped into the cool night air. The moon was high silver on the water. I walked home slower than usual, the sound of the waves grounding me with each step. When I reached the cottage, the porch light was still on. Mom was waiting at the table inside a half-finished sketch in front of her. She looked up, seeing the worry in my face. "Another one?" she asked. I nodded. "Same blocked number." She sighed, setting down her pencil. "We can't let the past keep knocking on our door, Hannah." I sat beside her, resting my hand over hers. "I know, but it's still out there somewhere. Someone who helped us without ever showing their face." She was quiet for a while, then said, "Maybe that's how it's supposed to be. Not every truth needs a name attached to it." I wanted to believe her, but part of me still needed to know. The next morning, I woke early to the sound of the ocean. The tide was high, the waves breaking close to shore. Mom stood near the waterline, her sketchbook open, the breeze flipping its pages. I joined her, and for a while neither of us spoke. Then she smiled, faint but certain. "Whoever sent that message," she said, "gave us a chance to live. That's enough." I looked out at the horizon, at the endless blue stretching beyond what we could see. Maybe she was right. Maybe the unanswered things were part of the peace we'd found. Still, as the wind carried her words out toward the sea, I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was still watching over us. That night, after she went to bed, I sat on the porch with a blanket and my phone resting beside me. The stars stretched sharp and bright above the ocean, and the air was cool against my skin. I opened the messages one last time, scrolling through each one, each line that had changed the course of our lives. Then I pressed delete. The screen went dark. For the first time in years, I didn't feel haunted. I just felt whole. The past was no longer chasing us. It had finally mercifully gone quiet. But I knew there was one more truth still waiting for us to face, and when it came, it wouldn't arrive by text or letter. It would come in a moment of grace neither of us expected. The ocean was calm that morning, the tide drawing slow, even breaths against the sand. My mother stood near the waterline barefoot, the hem of her jeans damp with foam. The early light painted everything in soft gold, the cottage roof, the curve of her shoulder, even the brush she held like it belonged there. I watched her from the porch for a long while before walking down to join her. She looked over and smiled that same quiet smile that had once seemed impossible to see again. We didn't talk much anymore about the past. The trial, the years of fear, even the letters that had arrived without names, they had all become part of a story we no longer needed to repeat. She had started a new series of paintings she called The Second Horizon, wide-open landscapes full of air and light. People from nearby towns came to her classes now, drawn less by her name and more by the calm she carried. I still worked from the studio designing logos for small coastal businesses, each one a small symbol of something lasting and true. The sign outside Evelyn and Hannah Design Studio had weathered its first winter. The paint faded slightly, but it held. Sometimes when the afternoons were quiet, we would sit side by side on the porch, tea mugs in hand, and watch the gulls trace circles over the water. It wasn't silence born of exhaustion anymore. It was peace, the kind you earn after walking through fire and somehow finding your way back to yourself. A few weeks after that last message, a small envelope arrived in our mailbox. No return address, just our names typed neatly on the front. Inside was a folded sheet of paper and a single Polaroid photo. The picture showed the cemetery at sunrise, the same willow trees bending toward the ground. In the lower corner, written in thin black ink, were 5 words: "She was never really alone." My mother read it once, then again, her fingers tracing the words. Whoever they are, she said they can rest now too. She tucked the photo into her sketchbook and closed it without another word. That was the last time we ever heard from whoever had helped us. Seasons shifted slowly on the coast. Spring crept in through the dunes, the daisies returning in clusters near the fence line. Life had a way of rebuilding itself when you stopped trying to force it. My mother began hosting weekend art shows in the local cafe, donating most of the proceeds to shelters that supported women starting over. It's not about telling my story, she told one reporter who found her again. It's about helping others paint a new one. We never mentioned my father again. The papers said he was transferred to a facility in eastern Oregon, that he'd taken a job managing the library. Maybe he'd found a version of quiet too. The anger that used to follow his name no longer lived in me. Time had done its slow work smoothing the sharp edges until all that was left was distance. On the anniversary of our move to the coast, my mother and I drove to the overlook above the beach. The wind was strong that day, the kind that carried salt into your hair and laughter out over the cliffs. She brought one of her small canvases, a painting of the sea at dawn, the light spilling in through clouds. For the person who sent the first message, she said. We left it tucked under a driftwood beam near the trail, the wind pressing against it like a promise kept. That night, after she went to bed, I sat outside with the lantern on low and listened to the tide. The moon hung pale above the water, and the waves rolled in with that steady rhythm that had followed us from the beginning. I thought about everything that had led us here, the fear, the courage, the strange kindness of an unseen hand, and how justice hadn't come from revenge or punishment, but from truth, finding its way through the dark. I glanced toward the window where my mother's lamp still glowed faintly through the curtains. We had both learned something in all of this, though it took losing everything to see it clearly. Justice doesn't always arrive with noise or victory speeches. Sometimes it's a soft morning after years of storms, a clean breath, a life rebuilt in quiet dignity. Before I went inside, I whispered a thank you to the stranger who had guided us to the ocean that had carried us forward, and to the woman inside who refused to stop fighting for her own peace. The lantern flickered once, then steadied, and I smiled. If you've ever been through your own kind of storm, I hope you know this peace doesn't mean forgetting. It means knowing you survived and that the world kept a space for you to begin again. Take care of yourself, and if this story stayed with you, share it with someone who might need a reminder that even the darkest chapters can end in light.